it's my first lore video. I'm so freaking nervous. My name's Amethyst. I am usually on Twitch. I am a painter there. As far as me as a person, I got my Bachelor of Arts and my Master's of Arts in English Literature. I specialized in medieval hagiography and chivalric studies. And honestly, I wanted to talk about Warhammer all throughout my grad school experience, but I never really got the chance because nobody in my cohort seemed to be interested. So here I am, I guess, like 2 years after I graduated, but hey, better late than never, right? Really what I want to do here is a little bit different from the average lore video. I figured the sort of broad strokes lore you can get from many different great sources. There are so many channels that do it well out there that it'd be like, okay, well, I wanted to do something different. We are probably going to get in depth into one book in particular from the Warhammer universe. We are going to incorporate some classical lit. If you hear me banging around, that's because I have my gorgeous copy of Frankenstein here. So I want to use classical lit to help you understand lore better as a piece of literature, because these people work very hard, and I very much think that the authors of the Black Library novels are very well read, very educated, very smart people, and they don't just put things down for no reason. I want to also introduce some people to classical lit. I know it can be really scary. I mean, I studied it for 6 years, and still some things, like I had to read Paradise Lost for this, and it was crazy difficult to read after kind of not reading classical literature for a while. So maybe it can give you guys like a jumping in point. It gives you sort of a primer for different works. Without further ado, I will get into the actual video. So the general view of the Night Lords is that they resemble vampires, which is true to a certain extent. Aesthetically, they bear great resemblance to Bram Stoker's Dracula. The iconography of the skull with the bat wings, right, invokes the idea of Dracula turning into a bat, and the lightning painted onto their armor reminds me a lot of the storms that Dracula brought to England in the novel. And if you actually watch The Last Voyage of the Demeter, I think they did the storm thing really well, because Dracula brings storms with him, right? He brings disaster, he brings darkness. These are all things that the Night Lords do. They also like keeping the shadows. And immediately that calls back, of course, sunless creatures, right? Vampires can't go out in the sun unless you're in Twilight. Imagine a sparkly Night Lord. Maybe that's what I should do with my kill team. So the heavy aesthetic influence of Gothic architecture reminds me a lot of Castle Dracula. This is kind of a thing throughout Warhammer in general. We love some Gothic architecture here. Not to mention also the use of terror tactics is a real callback to the real history of Vlad the Impaler, who Dracula is based on. We see that Curze, honestly, is not really a general. He hates being a general. He doesn't really like conquering worlds outside of Nostromo. He kind of did Nostromo almost out of necessity. We kind of see an inconsistency here in this interpretation. The aesthetics fit great. Girl, pop off. But as far as themes go, I think it leaves much to be desired. Where Dracula lived to conquer, he was a general who boasts of the long line of generals in his family, right? He's very proud of his family. Some things just aren't lining up. There's another influence, which I believe is much more thematically accurate for the Legion, though, and that's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This influence stretches beyond the obvious connection to unholy creation, and it comes down to the creed Curze and his Legion lives by. His unending search for revenge and his twisted sense of justice are very much in line with the monster from Frankenstein's own motives. And as this comparison brings to mind the ideas of free will, damnation, and redemption. While rereading Frankenstein for this video, there is one other thing that caught my eye. Shelley shows that her monster identifies strongly with the narrative of Paradise Lost. Once I started thinking about all these three works in relation to each other, there's a lot of interesting comparisons and conclusions that came to mind, and I think it changed the way I look at Curze and the Night Lords. I believe that by shifting the discussion from Dracula to Frankenstein, and by association with Frankenstein, Paradise Lost, we may come to understand Curze's story as less about aesthetics and more about his internal struggle, thereby understanding the message of the story better. I also believe that this gives us a clue into what the Night Lords should have been. Cross-referencing these three major works, I will show the thematic influences of Frankenstein and Paradise Lost in Night Haunter, and how this new interpretation changes the central messages of Curze's story, namely the nature of justice, corruption of the natural order, and what Curze's philosophy ultimately brings. Now, for the sake of precision, I will avoid exploring the finer points of Curze's ideology and its basis in real-world philosophy. I will also limit this study to Night Haunter and a short passage from Soul Hunter. So to start us off, I'm going to talk about the sources and sort of what their general plot is. So Paradise Lost is an epic retelling of the fall of man from the Garden of Eden. Epic being, it's a big poem. It's actually very beautifully written, one of the greatest works of English literature, in my opinion. And the Horus Heresy does owe a lot to Paradise Lost. And the more I read for, this video, the more I'm like, oh man, that's like totally Horus. It's like totally Fulgrim, right? So you should give it a read if you're a big Horus Heresy fan. I think it's going to make the experience much more robust for you. But suffice to say that it is a retelling of the Judeo-Christian story of the fall of man from the Garden of Eden. So for those of you who might not know what the fall of Adam and Eve looks like, I'll go ahead and explain it. Hey guys, editing Amethyst here. I just realized that I explained the fall of man very poorly. So basically, God creates the universe, he creates angels. Now, Milton says that some of those angels didn't want to relinquish power to the Son of God, who is going to be instilled as the right hand of God the Father. So, in Milton's version at least, some of the angels fall because they think that they deserve a higher place than the Son of God. And so they get cast into their own dominion of hell to rule as they see fit, I guess. And then man is created. Satan comes up and tempts Adam and Eve by saying, you will be like a god if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the humans do, and then they are cast from paradise. Now, there's lots of themes in here about the fall of man in general, and it is reflected in Paradise Lost. This is a fundamentally religious text. So when I talk about Paradise Lost, I'm going to get a little bit into theology here. Now, I will have a bit of a disclaimer here. Some of the theology surrounding the fall of man and the redemption of man with Jesus Christ's sacrifice on the cross, that can be debated in many theological circles as to how this kind of thing works metaphysically. It's debated whether or not Christ was taking on wrathful punishment or whether something else was happening. And there's just lots of debating in here. Throughout the video, I'm going to give certain interpretations when needed, but I'm going to try to stick away from the theology for now and the theological debates, because that's just too much to get into. Now for Frankenstein, this is a story written by Mary Shelley. This was written during the capital R Romance period of literature. And what you're going to be seeing here is nature and highlighting what we call the sublime. So there's like the beautiful and the sublime. Sublime is like, it's so big and so pretty, it's terrifying. That is very Warhammer. So the fact that they're borrowing, I think, from a lot of romance literature is like perfect. I also want to point out that the Romance period is known for its fascination with the supernatural, with the mysterious, anything that's not easily explained. And this was a time where social conventions were starting to kind of get a little bit more shaky. People were starting to be more individualistic. So I just wanted to point out a few more things. There are other things that the Romance period is known for, but that came to mind, and I think I forgot to add it in. This was written as a contest. The competition was between Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, and John Polidori. Yeah. Or they said, let's have a story competition. And that story competition was who can write the scariest story. The genesis of this came about actually in a dream when she was, I think, much younger. And the dream, and you'll see this scene in Frankenstein, so if you read it, keep an eye out for it. So you'll see the scene where Victor's lying in bed, and then his curtains get pulled back on his bed, and there's a hulking figure with glowing yellow eyes staring down at him. And that was the genesis of Frankenstein. So the basic plot of Frankenstein is that a man wants to create the perfect man. And he uses a blend of science and occult magic to do it, actually. So it is mentioned specifically that he reads things like accounts on the Philosopher's Stone or the elixir of life. These are alchemy. These are considered sort of occult practices. And that's part of his source for creating this monster. And he wanted to create a man that was physically very capable, very intelligent, and would not die unless by violent death. All good plans never survive first contact with the enemy, as I like to say. Victor sees the monster awake, and it's actually much less climactic than a lot of the movies make you believe. He just kind of groans and wakes up, and Victor sees this, and he's like, oh my god, he's beautiful, like, I cooked, dude, I cooked here. And then he sees the monster's eyes, and he starts to really let it sink in as to what he just did. He eventually abandons his creation. Several months go by, he's having a great time with his friend, and then his little brother is killed. And he has to go home. Long story short, he was murdered. Someone thinks it was, I believe, the governess or the maid who did it, because they had, you know, the little boy's locket on them. But he's like, no, it can't be her. It has to be the monster. And she's been framed. And the thing is that she loved that little boy. Like, he was her own brother or son. So it's like crazy that she'd kill him, right? And he's like, this has got to be the monster sending me a message. Eventually he sees the monster, and the monster says, yeah, that was me. Straight up, that was me. And I'm doing it because I'm lonely, and I want a bride, because I feel like I am an Adam all to myself. Here we're gonna get Paradise Lost, right? He's been reading Paradise Lost. He's been seeing the idea of Adam and Eve, and he's like, I'm obviously Adam, and I need an Eve who is just as hideous, made from the same corruption that I am, so that way I'm not alone. And I swear I will fuck off to the, like, Amazon rainforest, I think is what they say specifically, and live off of nuts and berries, and we won't bother anyone. Just give me someone to love. Victor sets to work on that, and he immediately starts thinking, this is a mistake, I can't make another person like this. And then he sees the monster in the doorway, and he just snaps, and he rips the female monster apart. The other monster understandably gets upset because his soon-to-be lover is just torn apart before his eyes. Now it's like, all right, you know what? I tried. I really did. I tried to be civil with you, Victor, but I'm gonna kill everybody you love. And he does just that. Now there's a huge thing going on between Victor and the monster. The monster tells him, I will be with you on your wedding night. And he's like, oh, he's gonna kill me on my wedding night. That's screwed up. He doesn't kill him, he kills his bride. At that point, Victor's broken. He's shattered. He doesn't even have his true love anymore. So he runs away to the Arctic, and then is chased down by the monster. When we actually see the book open, it is on the ship that Victor takes refuge in the Arctic Circle. He's on death's door, exhausted, sick, and despite the sailors trying to bring him back from the brink, they can't. Eventually he dies, but he passes on his side of the story, which is actually most of the book, is him talking about his experience meeting the monster, what the monster is like, and after Victor dies, then we get to see the monster in the final scene. And the monster is talking directly to the captain of the ship and telling him certain things about his experience. And then the monster goes to unalive himself by immolation. So, by burning. And that's where we get the end of the story. He just kind of runs off. And that's the last we see of him. Konrad Curze, The Night Haunter. Yeah, okay, cool. This is his Primarch novel. Every Primarch in the Horus Heresy gets one, and it just kind of goes through their life story. We start on Saguelsa, so this is after the heresy. Konrad is talking to a flesh effigy of his father, made from people who have been unalived by him. He's talking to the Emperor, and he's sort of like giving his life story. Konrad started his life on Nostromo. After all the Primarchs were scattered to the winds, the way he enters the planet is he literally enters the planet. His gestation pod, boom, right? Just cuts right through the core. Well, not through the core, but I think to basically the core. And this, if it's not in the core, it's close. He like landed in magma. Maybe like the crust. What is it? Like there's the core, and then there's like the undermantle or something, and there's like the little magma circle in the crust. It's something like that. He was surrounded by magma, right? He landed in a pit. And so as a baby he has to crawl his way out. He doesn't really tell that part. We can get that from other novels. The planet as a whole is just horrible. It is truly awful living conditions. Everybody's out to get everybody. It's like horrible Gotham. You cannot go 2 steps without someone getting hurt. This is the world he grows up on. And we come to find out, you know, through the events of the Horus Heresy, and just kind of what Konrad says, is that he's very preoccupied with the idea of justice. And he lands on an unjust world. He sees people hurting each other, and he takes matters into his own hands. And he basically kills anyone who is a criminal. It doesn't matter how small your crime is. Well, eventually, people start kind of catching on that their gang mates are being killed and literally hung up, disemboweled and stuff. Really nasty deaths.
This is certainly no laughing matter.
And people start talking about it, and they're like, oh, the Night Haunter. The Night Haunter will get you if you're a criminal. Watch out for the Night Haunter. And then eventually, Konrad Curze starts getting better, starts getting bolder. Crime starts dropping, but then he sees the reason for it, in a way. You have people in the lower hives, they're just trying to survive, right? And so they resort to a life of crime. And you have people in the upper hives, who are criminals in their own right, because they are the elite class that allow this to go on. And they're corrupt, they're working with the crime families, things like that. And he's like, all right, I've had enough. And he starts targeting the officials in the upper hive. And starts, like, he's been broadcasting some of his killings for a while now. And then he gets to them. And then the entire planet starts kind of falling in line. And then eventually, he either unalives all of the officials, or they just bend the knee. And he becomes known as the Dark King, right? He is the king of Nostromo at that point. The Horus Heresy ensues, he rebels, and he is eventually captured by his brothers, taken aboard a loyalist ship, and stripped of his armor, stripped of his weapons, stuff like that. And then Sanguinius shoots him out of the airlock in a stasis coffin, where he kind of drifts in space for a while. Until a ship named the Sheldrune picks up this coffin. And he eventually gets out of the coffin. And this is sort of, when I say like aesthetically, they're very much in line with Dracula, right? I mean it. Like, this really reads like Dracula on the Demeter. So whenever, if you guys read Dracula, you will know that Dracula gets put in his coffin onto the Demeter, and then he kind of hunts people down in the middle of the night. And they're trying to stop him. He starts hunting the people of the Sheldrune down. And eventually the only one left is Elver. I don't think we ever get a last name for Elver. I think it's just Elver. Who is like basically a little grunt on the ship that was supposed to be trained, but the shipmaster is a horrible person and never did that for him. And so he ends up serving Konrad because he basically has no other option. Konrad gives the reason for keeping him alive that he requires company, he requires entertainment. And so he basically torments this poor little guy for like 4 years. They land on Sagualsa, and if you guys like the Night Lords Omnibus, you will get to see Talos and Vandred and the First Claw, because they meet Curze first. That's sort of where the story technically picks up, is about that time. And he is waiting for an assassin to come unalive him, because his father sent an assassin to Curze to have him pay for his crimes. He's going to execute him by assassin. That's the basic broad strokes of the story. The story just kind of cuts off right as the assassin steps through the door, and we know that Curze allowed himself to be executed. And that's basically what we know. And I haven't finished reading the Omnibus. I know they find like a recording, so I'm guessing they're going to do more with the Calidus Temple. Excited for that. So that's the general story overviews that we're working with. So let's just go ahead and get into the main argument portion. And I'm going to start with sort of like superficial comparisons. I really like doing it this way. I like going from least abstract to most abstract. So right now it's least abstract, the things that you can just see. Curze's body spasms and twitches a lot when we see him first in Night Haunter. Just kind of twitching. It's like he's going through rigor mortis, which honestly immediately reminds me of the fact that the monster is just kind of a stitched together corpse made from the corpses of humans and animals. So in a sense, the monster is made from death. With the monster being made from death, we could come to the conclusion that Curze is also made from death. Night Haunter, as an image, was made from the death of others. Think about it. If you hadn't unalived all those people, if you hadn't hung their bodies up for everybody to see, he would never have been Night Haunter. That is Night Haunter. It's made from death. His image is made from death. Who he is made from death. We also see this with Satan from Paradise Lost, who brought death into the world when he led Adam and Eve into corruption. When he led them to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that's what exiled them from the Garden of Eden. He brought death into the world with that. Because, as I'll cover later, the garden was a paradise, food could be grown on a whim, and I think some people even believe that humans were immortal back then. And then when they were driven from the garden because of their transgression, they lost that. They lost immortality, and the world knew death. This comparison of Curze, Satan, and the monster being made of death will serve as a backbone for later arguments. Now here's something fun too about the physical. Though they're all corrupted, all three characters show beauty in some way. Victor had selected the creatures' features as beautiful. The way that he stitched his body together, the musculature, everything was beautiful. Satan is also still described as holding some of his heavenly beauty, because while he was an agent of heaven, while he was an angel, he was beautiful. And throughout Nighthaunter, Curze is described at various points as being perfect or beautiful as well. However, there's something fundamentally wrong with all of them. For example, in chapter 4 of Paradise Lost, when Satan goes from contemplating redemption to fully giving into his hatred for God and the human race, his face changes from beauty to being just kind of off. Thus while he spake, each passion dimmed his face, thrice changed with pale ire, envy, and despair, which marred his borrowed visage and betrayed him counterfeit, if any eye beheld. So it marred his visage, it physically changed him, it made him uglier, and betrayed him as counterfeit, meaning that he's just kind of fake. All of this beauty is fake, if any eye beheld. And of course, his vices of ire, envy, despair are visibly dimming his face. So he's going from being a beautiful agent of light to something corrupted and dark. And he is, all that beauty you know is fake now. There's also another scene in the court of hell, because there is a court in hell, like a king's court, where we see Satan's damaged beauty described. Here's that passage. Satan, except none higher sat, with grave aspect he rose, and his rising seemed a pillar of state, deep on his front engraven, deliberation sat, and public care, and princely counsel in his face yet shone. Majestic, though in ruin, sage he stood, with Atlantean shoulders, fit to bear the weight of the mightiest monarchies. His look drew audience and attention, still as night on summer noontide's air. So we're immediately seeing, like, if you get like the kingly broad-shouldered image, that's sort of what Milton's going for here. So commanding, beautiful, but fake. This is all fake. Now, Nighthaunter mentions several times how Curze has the posture of a crone, so he's like hunched over, or how he reeks of decay, among many other physical signs of corruption. One of my favorites, actually, is like he's kind of like grinding his teeth a little bit on Sagualsa, and they're like rattling around in his gums because they're half decayed in there. It's really gross. His breath probably stinks so bad. Oh my gosh. In Satan's case, this corruption had not always been there. He was once an agent of life, as an angel, but after his fall, his body took on a sense of wrongness, as if there had once been potential that had been twisted. In Curze's and the monster's case, this was a design flaw from the beginning. The monster's much more obvious. He was made from death. Like, he was made from dead bodies. He was half decayed. It's obvious there. Curze is a little bit less obvious. They were made in an act of blasphemous creation, and further twisted by a fallen world. They were created and formed by corruption, even if their original design was to be the pinnacle of humanity. From the very beginning, the act of blasphemous creation kind of made them flawed. So the next superficial thing that we come to is environment. The final climactic confrontation between the monster and Victor happens in the Arctic. Curze meets his end on Sagualsa, which is a bitterly cold and dead world, Carrion world. These two, at least, are easy enough to compare. But the first time we see Satan in Paradise Lost, he's in a lake of fire. Now, we could compare that to Curze breaking through the crust and hitting magma, right? I mean, Curze kind of meets his beginning in fire, but I'm not going to pay as much attention to that. It takes a little bit more digging to glean the similarity between Paradise Lost, environments, Frankenstein, and the Nighthaunter. Remember that Satan led Adam and Eve to fall? Up until that point, they both lived in Eden, a place of ceaseless life where growing food could be done on a whim. And here's a little passage that kind of talks about Eden and Paradise Lost. Of Eden, where delicious paradise now nearer crowns her enclosure green, as with rural mound the champaign head of a steep wilderness whose hairy sides, with thicket overgrown, grotesque and wild, and overhead upgrew, insuperable height of the loftiest shade, cedar and pine and fir and branching palm, a sylvan scene, and as the ranks ascend, shade above shade, a woody theatre of stateliest view, yet higher than their tops, the verdurous wall of paradise upsprung, goodliest trees, loaden with fairest fruit, blossom and fruits at once golden hue, appeared with gay enamelled colors mixed. A few lines I want to draw attention to here. So with thickest overgrown, grotesque and wild. This is sort of saying that the green, like her enclosure green, is almost grotesque and how much it's wild, right? It's so lively that it's just so much. It's like green everywhere and life everywhere. It's almost grotesque. That's how alive everything is. We get a bunch of stuff about sylvan scenes. That is an idea of fairylands being evergreen. That's sort of calling back to that sort of mythology that a lot of people in England would share. We have goodliest trees, loaden with fairest fruit, blossoms and fruits at once of golden hue appeared with gay enamelled colors mixed. This is giving you the idea that, you know, the trees just have fruit everywhere and they are beautifully colored and it looks like enamel. And if you've ever seen enamel on, like, say, a crown, it is technicolored, it's beautiful, it's vibrant. So the image we're getting here is something that's so green and so alive and so vibrant and colorful that it's just almost sensory overload. So that is where Adam and Eve was first sort of called their residence. That is Eden. That's the idea that Milton has. Okay, now, once corruption becomes a part of their being, this is what a lot of scholars will say it means to know good and evil. It's not know as in a sense of they had no idea before what good and evil are. It's more like they know it in, like, the biblical sense. So it's almost like they consummated a relationship with good and evil. Once corruption becomes a part of their being, once they know good and evil, they are cast out into a world of death. This is where kind of the theology comes in, and it does happen in Paradise Lost. They're driven from the garden, and now things can die. They have to toil now to survive in a world that can decay. Whereas growing food was just easy. You just had to kind of weed the garden sometimes, right? And then you got food. Now things are like, oh no, how did my mint die? I thought mint was a weed. The fact that Curze and the monster are at home, though, in Arctic, in harsh environments where things can die and decay, isn't just about the weather. It's about how in winter and in cold weather and in barren times, things die. Nothing can grow or thrive in the Arctic winter or on any day in Sagualsa. So here these characters are, making their homes in places of death. This is where they feel comfortable. There are many ways to have community with other people, but I'll focus on sort of non-familial and fatherhood specifically. To be honest, I don't have anything particularly of note to say about Paradise Lost, so I'll avoid discussion of the book for now. I mean, yes, there's like a court in hell, so obviously Satan, values community. Humanity is community all to itself. You have Adam and Eve together as husband and wife, but I don't really have much to say on it. I think you can probably get the idea. The monster and Curze hold a similarity in that neither had a mentor or father. And Soul Hunter had stated explicitly that Curze is the only primarch who grew up alone, hidden from the eyes of humanity, guided by no hand and taught by no elder. The monster kind of takes a little bit after that as well. With Victor having run away from his creation, the monster then kind of fumbles around meeting people and watching them run in terror. If you think giant half-decayed toddler, then you'll have the image Shelley went for. Since he was taught by no elder, like Curze, he never learned language and thus couldn't speak to the wider population. He couldn't tell them and make them understand that he meant no harm. And as his mind was developing, because it did have to develop for a time, even his vision had to develop, just like a baby, really. He started to understand that his existence was wrong, though he held hope that he could one day have friends and something like a family, which he desperately wanted. Then he found the cottagers and the blind old man who lived with them. So this is like a family. You have the older man who is blind, he can't see, and his son, and I believe his daughter. Yes, his son and daughter. And eventually his son's fiance. When he found the cottagers, he saw his chance. Maybe if he was benevolent enough and showed them his soul was good, he could have a family. So he hatches a plan. First, supplied them with much needed firewood to establish himself as a benefactor from the shadows. And they actually do call him a good spirit without knowing what he is. Then, while he keeps up this habit, he learns their language. So now there's no miscommunication, right? I can actually talk to you now. And finally, the plan is he'll go to the old man, slowly get to know him, and then the old man will surely love him because he's such a nice guy and will want to introduce him to the others. And the plan goes really well for a while. He even gets so far as to introduce himself to the father and soft launches that he needs help breaking the ice to people he considers friends. So he's talking about, oh, this family, they'll probably think I'm a horrible person. And the old man's like, why? You seem nice. And the old man even offers to help him break the ice. But honestly, this part of the plan, meeting the old man, is going a little bit quicker than he thought. He wasn't prepared for just how generous the old man was, because he ends up asking what these friends' names are and where they live. Now, up until this point, the monster kind of vaguely answers the questions that the old man is giving, saying things like, oh, they're a French family, or they live near this spot. But now he gets a direct question of, like, basically, hey, where exactly do they live and what's their names? Paraphrasing, of course. At this point, the monster just kind of breaks down sobbing. He can't help it because he's so scared he's gonna blow it. And a horror of horrors, not only is this monster just sobbing, he doesn't get to answer the question because now he hears the son, named Felix, his fiance, and his sister outside of the door. So the rest of the cottagers are there because he was just alone with this old guy. So then he throws himself at the old man's feet and just kind of blurts out that, no, you're the friends I'm talking about. You're the ones I want you to introduce me to break the ice to. And he was talking about them. And the old man is understandably horrified at this grown man hugging his legs and crying into his lap to save him. And Felix sees this display and proceeds to rip the monster from his father, where he starts beating him with, like, a stick. The monster here doesn't fight back, though he acknowledges that he could have torn them all limb from limb. But instead, he takes the beating until he finally runs away. For hours after, he's howling like an injured beast as he goes through the forest, not even caring who he sees. He doesn't care if his identity is revealed. He's just howling. He's beside himself. He is hurt. This is a really heart-wrenching part of this, that despite his eloquent speech, his impossible frame, like just how sheer big he is, and having all the markings of a grown man, the monster reverts to a childlike helplessness, going so far as to have a full meltdown. Even when he's struck by Felix, he cries as a child would. He doesn't even try to defend himself. With his only defense that he goes to when this is happening as being a complete reliance on the old man, the father figure. The way he hugs the old man's knees and begs him to save and protect him, to not desert him in the hour of trial, shows a desire to be helpless and protected by the father, even though the way he says it is much more in line with classical literature. So what he's saying is very sort of flowery and beautiful and mature, but he's still basically like begging his father to save him. That is what's happening. It's still like a child's plea. The strange cognitive dissonance that we get here between the actions of a child and the speech of a man suggests that he needs a guardian in order to fully develop. When he lacks this, he will try to find a father figure in any way he can, just to have someone to save and guide him in his times of need, just like children need to thrive. This basic need is ripped from him, and all he can do is cry out like a child being taken from their parents. He's helpless now and has to accept that he'll never have this fundamental need fulfilled for development. In a single blow, he abandons the idea of finding a guardian and forming any community with humans. I mean, he still has some hope, but that's later on assured to him that now I can't have a relation with humans. This is kind of where it starts. definitely. His sort of like, humans cannot relate to me. Now, you kind of have to look a little closer if you want to understand Curze's desires to live amongst humanity, because, I mean, he kind of tortures and unalives a lot of people. But he had no father, so he only had Nostromo Quintus's population to form a connection with. In response to the crimes Curze would see, he would, quote, leap up from the shadows, feral and enraged, butchering those who preyed upon their fellow humans. True, this is said to be his way of establishing order in his environment, but by doing so, wittingly or unwittingly, he's establishing his role as a bringer of retribution on Nostromo, a judge. He's the judge, the jury, the executioner. Because he was in a brutal world, he reached out in a similar fashion. This sort of way of establishing himself as a judge is similarly brutal to the world that he's in. Even though Nostromo's social order seemed to force his hand to be violent, he shares the monster's desire to walk among his people as a benevolent member of society. And here we come back to Curzon. We can see this come into play when Curze has two possible visions for futures for the boy Curzon. For a moment, he considers sparing the boy so that he may mentor him, and grows to be a great man who brings positive change and thanks the Night Haunter for his guidance. There was a part of him right here at one point that wanted to be their protector and their mentor. He wanted to sort of be a benevolent member, just as the monster did. Now, of course, the other possible future is that Curzon takes up a blade and stabs him, and it really hurts. Doesn't kill him, but it really hurts, and now the Night Haunter's basically a joke on the planet, and nobody really pays attention to his sort of vigilante justice. He believes in the worst possible future because that's all he's ever seen, and then he just kills the boy. And it's actually quite obvious that the first future would have come to pass, to me at least, because the knife was way too far away from Curzon, and Curzon was already walking toward the Night Haunter. So really, if he would have let fate take a chance, Nostromo could have been different. Anyway. Now, he could have a relationship with mortals. We see primarchs doing that all the time. Vulcan, Sanguinius, the usual suspects there, for examples. He could have had a relationship with them if he would have followed a different path. But it's true that he would find it hard to relate to any of them. He's a primarch. He's basically next step in evolution. He's not human. He's something different. If he wanted companionship among equals, he would have needed to form a relationship with his father and his brothers. They're the ones who can understand him. They're the superhumans. Off rip, it seemed like there was animosity toward his father. But even at the end of his life, this is something I want to point out. Curze curls up against the flesh-sculpted effigy of the Emperor, hoping his hallucinations will allow it to speak in the Emperor's voice again. Because it does speak to him. It might be his hallucinations. It might actually be an Emperor's vision given to him. But he hears it. I argue that he's seeking community here at the most fundamental level at this part. I think he's looking for a father when he does this. It's too late to form any connections with his brothers. Some of them are dead. Some of them hate him now that he's a traitor. Others are just broken monsters. How is he gonna realistically form any sort of connection with his brothers? But perhaps it doesn't have to be this way with his father. The way he does it as well, by like curling up next to it, sort of like I get the image of like him curling up in like a fetal position. The way he does it by curling up seems very vulnerable and childlike. It's sort of like the same thing with like the monster hugging the old man's knees. The gesture suggests that he wants to find comfort from the father he never had. Though he was superhuman, he was still a child. Right? He developed very quickly. His intellect and everything developed very quickly, and he very much became a man like at a very early age, right? But he was still a child. I mean, think about Gilliman. He had a mother. Oh, he had a father. They raised him. Korax had it. And so many had mentors to guide them through childhood that presumably they were even allowed to act childlike and have that sort of reliance on somebody else. Though he was superhuman, he was a child at some point, and should have received protection and nurturing from a parental figure like Gilliman, like the Khan, like all of the primarchs that had a mentor. But instead, he had to spend those years providing for and protecting himself on a world where he could have been attacked, unalived, and being eaten isn't off the table either. No pun intended. Presumably, Gilliman and the others who had parental figures actually were allowed to be children. Curze was never given that. They were at least allowed to be children in as much of a context as their world allowed and their station allowed. They had someone to guide and protect them. I think in his final moments of life, when nobody else is there to see it, it says a lot when we see him choose to be with his father in a gesture that begs for protection. You can't exactly defend yourself when your knees are up here. You can't fight back. You have to be protected there. And this is the sort of thing that kids will do when they feel unsafe. They'll curl up, they'll go in defensive mode because their parent will defend them. This action calls back the scene also where the monster weeps at the old man's feet, and I think is used to portray the same idea. Just like the monster had no guardian, Curze was never granted the most fundamental relationship between father and son. So he found it in any way he could to comfort himself in his final hours. Remember, this is also another point I want to wrap back to. Remember that this sculpture is also made from the bodies of other people, the dead bodies of other people. So you could look at this as a metaphor that his father, the thing that protected him and nurtured him while he was growing on Nostromo, is death. Maybe combining these two ideas, you could say that the Emperor himself is death. I mean, the Emperor brought death to many worlds. He meant death for many people. He meant tyranny for many people. So the Emperor could also be death. He made Curze and his legion do the things that they do. He ordered them to strike terror and unalive innocent people. So the Emperor could be death as well. This opens up an interesting interpretation for both stories as well. Okay? The monster reasons that the old man, who can't see that he's a monster, will be the one to save him. In the case that Curze sees the Emperor in the effigy as opposed to death, he knows his father approved of his methods of gaining compliance and fully believes his father made him to be a monster. That was what he was created to be. So it would follow that the Emperor wouldn't see him as corrupt for the monster he became. It was just applied in the wrong way. Good spirit, wrong application. And death, if we add that into the mix, it gets a little bit more abstract here. When we consider that in both cases their gestures suggest a bid for protection, we remember that the father's purpose in the common imagination is to be protector and savior. And a father is someone that should be able to look past the son's flaws in order to tirelessly guide them through life. The monster sees the old man as a savior, allowing us to conclude that at this point he believes that compassion, which is a virtue that the old man represents in the monster's mind, can still lift him from his state. He is the only one that could see the monster for the man he is. Curze, on the other hand, is under no such pretenses. He believes no such thing. Compassion was never part of the equation. And he's completely rebelled against his father. So compassion was not necessarily the Emperor's strong suit. And then when he rebelled against his father, now all compassion is completely just severed. His relationship with the Emperor ended in the Emperor sending an assassin to kill him. Whether or not you think that's justified, I'm not going to get into that. He did, however, send someone to kill him. Not necessarily redeem him, but kill him. So he will find only judgment from the man that is the Emperor. Now we know that the Emperor's not going to protect him. He's just going to unalive him. Now you could say that's saving him. I'll get into why that's not the case later, in my opinion. But suffice to say, the Emperor's not there to protect him anymore. He's not a typical father figure like that. What's left now, then, to comfort Konrad in his final hours? It's not a father. It's not the Emperor. It's not his brothers. It's not his sons. It's the presence that's raised him from cradle. Death. When he curls up next to the effigy, he is silently asserting that death is what will save him. Death is the only thing that can lift him from his state of madness. Death was always there to assure him that his methods were valid, and in death he'll find vindication, which might finally put his soul to rest. Hey guys, Editing Amethyst here. I originally had more in this video, but if I kept it all in, it would be well over 2 hours, possibly into 3 hours long, and I just didn't think that I could ask anybody to watch something that long. So sadly, this is it for this week, but the next part will be dropping hopefully around November 5th or 6th, so right before the Del Toro Frankenstein Netflix release. So if you guys want to watch that before you guys watch the movie on Netflix, Hopefully it will be out by then and you can do so. In the meantime, thank you guys for watching this part. Stay leaping, lemurs, and I'll see you guys in about a week.